Back again. I was promising to do a book launch, but unfortunately health and safety don't like it. But anyone who's interested, Needles of Stone with a couple of new chapters is now back in print, and 2 others in the dowsing area I've got back in print as well. For those who can't afford, these 2 are also available free download. So, oh dear, Tom Graves. I've just got to remember to turn this thing on and put a timer on it, as I have been asked to do, as in, for God's sake, shut up sometime. Yeah, great. There we are. Okay, best known for something like Needles of Stone, general confusionist. Also, as you'll see, my real role is a nuisance. Because what I'm mostly concerned about is things like this disgusting words like methodology. So what I'm doing here is looking at 3 things, and this is really the 2 new chapters that went into Needles were about looking back, what's happened over the last 30 years. Now, it's pretty terrifying to come back and look at a book after 30 years. What's going on right now, and some of the issues I'm seeing, and also some ways about what we can do about those problems now and where we can take them. So let's look back. Says he, desperately needing his glasses and pretending he doesn't need them. Yeah. So, like so many other people, my starting point was people like John Michel. Yes! And also Keith Critchlow. Keith Critchlow was the one who started me. For those of you who don't know him, he's so much of the country's expert on sacred geometry. He's the only Westerner to be asked to design a mosque in Mecca. So we're talking about someone who really knows his stuff. But what we had was this whole kind of blurring of disciplines, of mixing things together. Whole real excitement, but how much was actually real? And the other one that perhaps we didn't think about was some of the consequences of this excitement and the way we got everything going. We'll look at the Battle of the Beanfield very briefly later on. Those of you who remember this, Glastonbury in the 1970s, we had a very nasty period called No Hippies Served. All of the shops in the town had signs saying no hippies served. We have to remember that some of the other passions that we raise have some interesting and not very pleasant consequences. We need to be aware. So really, and I think I loved Michael Bott's comment earlier on today, that really we haven't got much further than Daniel Defoe's lovely phrase, that this is back in the 18th century. He said that all of that can be learned of them is that here they are. How much further really have we got from there? So, this is another frightening one. This is me back in the days when I still had hair. The whole thing of being enthusiastic, naive, and generally overexcited. We got lots of, and that whole feeling that so many of us have. I mean, anyone else, surely no one else has had any kind of excitement of this total stupidity called megalithomania. So, chasing wild ideas. Now, Michael Bott again was talking about staying at Rollright. I spent at least a couple of weeks living in a clapped-out Land Rover at Rollright. If you look closely, you can see the little piece of string leading away from the Kingstone at Rollright. It's almost straight down the screen, marking what I thought was an overground energy. As for what the hell, no question I could find something. As for what the hell it was, like Michael said today, I haven't a clue. I still haven't a clue. So playing with something like Rollright, the thing that we forget is just how complex these places are. For example, one of the things I found with dowsing was what seemed to be a 7 concentric circles coming outward and spreading outward from there. In fact, what they call the geophys, the magnetic anomaly surveys, found what they thought was a 7-fold spiral, so I probably wasn't that far wrong. But there's water lines going over there, there's all sorts of stuff buzzing around, there's some lovely stuff for splitting headaches. We had a lovely one with one of my students who she was dowsing and tripped over what she thought was a bunch of chervil, which grabbed hold of her, and she put a hand down to pick up her pendulum and found it was standing vertically upright like the Indian rope trick. So we've had all sorts of fun like this, but for what the hell it means, we haven't a clue. So let's look at someone else. This is where we were in the 70s. Dear old John Michel in his bright orange trousers. Everyone loves Stonehenge, but, you know, the gatherings of the tribes, all that kind of stuff. But they're just way too big and complex and layered. So that really, when we look at the kind of complexity of going on, anyone who thinks that they really know what's going on here is deluding themselves. We haven't got even anywhere near to starting. Most of what we've got now is still a little better than a guess. Then we've got layers within layers within layers. That's the avenue leading away. It's been there for 5,000 years. How? We don't quite know. Too many sheep, perhaps. I remember, yeah. Then we've got the 18th century milepost, the modern road, and the fence declaring possession. So we've got all this weaving of landscape and weaving of history, layers of time. We also had to deal with archaeologists, who at that time had some very interesting ideas about seamanship. This is Alan Sorrell, poor old Alan Sorrell, doing Richard Atkinson's reconstruction, otherwise known as suicide by sea. No one who has the slightest clue of seamanship would try to take a 4-ton stone on top of a raft across even the Bristol Channel, or actually across even a river. Much more likely, which is what dear old Tom Lethbridge suggested, and I noticed, Marshall, earlier today, that you sling it underwater between two curraghs, between two umiaks. We also have this whole kind of what you might call cultural imperialism, this sense of, well, they must be wild because we're civilized. Notice this lethal mastiff, barely restrained. Help, the wild dogs. Only mad dogs and Englishmen go out in the midday sun. So that, yeah. Oh yeah, if you think about this whole thing about burials, well, let's look at a modern church. Anyone who does an excavation of a church now would be certain that they only existed as tombs. After all you find in there is burials, isn't it? So we were looking at all sorts of things. We were regarded as the lunatic fringe. So we were looking at really crazy things like the relationship between sun and location, otherwise known as archaeoastronomy, otherwise known as a fully fledged academic discipline now. The world has changed a bit over the last 30 years, particularly in the academic field. A lot of what was on the lunatic fringe is now very much mainstream. But also we did quite a lot of, you see, if you look closely, you'll see the moon there exactly in line with the shadow to the right of the stone, the signs, but also the signs of the times, the interweaving of the past and the present. We looked at pretty strange and forsaken places. Anyone who knows Dartmoor will know the joys of an instant Dartmoor fog. This is Merivale, if anyone's interested, otherwise known as Jolly Wet. Unfortunately, Michael Bott has cheated me on this one. He's beat me to it. Menantol. You only ever see the three stones. Notice the fourth one next to the one that's there, and this one off to the side. Watch out for all the things that we know as fact. Even as it is, we know that that was reconstructed to be nicely in line. It wasn't historically. It was only, I think, in the mid-19th century. Someone lined it up to make it look better. So we have to watch out all the time. I often wonder with this kind of drama queens whether this is just the Damien Hirsts of the period. And the whole feeling, though, with so many of these places is they're very much alive or not. In this case, this one was completely dead. From a dowsing perspective, everything else, there was just nothing. What you don't see is, if you see this green line in the background, just over there's a 200-foot drop into a china clay mine, which illustrates the point about this idea of sacred sites being a mistake, because the site is no use at all without the landscape that it's in. It makes no point in preserving something in aspic when you've just killed its entire environment. There's also lots of nice booby traps. This is quite a nice, well-known one just on Merivale. Now, you'd be sure that's a dolmen, right? Or if you're coming to this from a Second World War historian, you'd think that's a pillbox. Actually, it's an apple crusher, left over from the medieval period, when this was still a warm, lush environment. Climate change is really nothing new. We do have to watch out. These kind of, the bizarre passion about stones, I mean, all of us pretty much feel, it's pretty dumb. You know, why should we get excited about old stones? It's kind of, really? But we have to remember too that other people had the same kind of feelings about stones, but got very upset about it. This is Stukely's drawing of Stonekiller Robinson. I think it's Stukely or Aubrey, I can't remember which one it is now. Who was a Puritan fanatic who set out to destroy every possible vestige of the previous culture. So the Taliban are really destroying the Buddhist temples in Afghanistan are really nothing new. We've had the same Puritan culture ourselves. We had some pretty sickening ones as well. This was at Rollright. It's still damaged. If you go there now, you'll still see the burn on it. This was some nice people who decided that sacrificing a puppy was the proper thing to do. This took a long time to clean up. The physical mess was bad enough, but the psychic mess is pretty horrible. And people who know Rollright would know that it's best described as moody. Though I think my best illustration, when Pauline Flick still owned it, she had a few friends there to do a little play. It turned out that the few friends were the Royal Shakespeare Company, and the play was The Tempest. That was her idea of a little play. But on the other hand, we have some people who have no real passions at all, except about controlling. And that was at the Battle of the Beanfield, just before. The whole idea of we own it, it's now just an asset of the tourist industry. Possession. We possess it. No one else can be there. Now, the passions that came up out of this, I know John Michel did a lovely little poem about it, but the wildness of the police who rioted and illegally assaulted hundreds of people, including dragging a pregnant woman through the front of a bus. There's some funny passions going on there. We have to remember that some of the stuff that's coming up is not as simple as we'd like to frame. So although it's quieter now, we do have to remember that all of this stuff is still in the background. The passions are real in a lot of different senses. So that really brings us on. 30 years later, 20, 30 years later, this is roughly where we are. We had all of those kind of things going on, the whole spiritual energies stuff. Hamish's work on the sun and the serpent. But, and there's a very big but, what we have now are some serious problems. And I'm well aware that some people won't like this. But we've got to face them. Please put those daggers away, even if they're nice Mycenaean ones from Stonehenge. So, number one, as they said beautifully about the Brother Bill's bloatware, a triumph of marketing over technical expertise. I think my saddest example of this, actually, Hamish would cringe when he hears this. I think I told you yesterday. There's a book I just came across a few days ago, which extends the Michael and Mary lines to the Azores, which proves that it's Atlantis. So let's be really unkind about this. The biggest problem we have is that the people who do the real work get ignored in favour of the glamour. There are people who've done decades of fine, detailed excavation. But the ones who get the bucks, the money, the television shows, everything else, are the people who rip them off. We need to stand up and say that this stuff is crap. We need to be very careful about what we actually come out. Otherwise, all of what we do is labelled lunatic fringe, and we have, well, one of the ones that comes up shortly. But the big problem, one of the problems we have here is the Golden Age. You know, a lot of people, I mean, most of us, we get started. One of the things that often gets us started is the whole Golden Age feel. But to be blunt, there really isn't that much evidence. If we look at any real-world analogues, like a lot of the Aboriginals where I worked with in Australia, there is no grand priesthood. There is no wild super science. What we have instead is a kind of, you know, there are elders certainly and shamans maybe, but there is no great priesthood. It's an artifact of clinging on to the Victorian idea of the great leader. It's an artifact of our own culture. But the biggest driver, I suspect, is what the Welsh call hiraeth. It's a really beautiful word that's almost untranslatable. It's usually mistranslated as homesickness, which is a huge understatement. A better way of describing it is it's a grieving and a longing for that which has never been, which is not and will never be. We need to respect that grieving. It's real and it hurts like hell. At the same time, please, let's not try and build garbage on what is actually something that is built out of hope. We need to be honest about this. The biggest problem we have is, to be blunt, shoveling the shit. The proper pronunciation of New Age is actually newage. It rhymes with sewage, the discarded remnant of what was once nutritious. What we've got is a kind of Disneyfication, a dumbing down. I come across this a lot in a lot of other areas. I mean, EM is bad. If you want to find one that really doesn't work, try ecofeminism, which has serious problems in terms of its own structure. But the biggest problem is that the different modes, the artist, the scientist, the magician, the mystic, have completely different types of truth. I'll come back to this in a moment, but we need to move through them in a way where we understand which mode we're in at each time. We have to watch really closely for phrases like clearly, and it's obvious, isn't it? And, oh, it must be because I think it is. Or, I got this last time, a classic Dowser's mistake. I got it here last time, so I must get it there next time. We have to be really careful about understanding what we're doing and watching for the dumbing down that feeds again into the hype problem. The next one is what we might call a problem of truth. I think my saddest example of this was a man who decided that, possibly because he wanted to make it scientific, dowsing could not be called dowsing. It was radial detection. A guide to the use of the radial detector, miscalled the defining rod. That was the title of his book. He said that only certain people could dowse. Now, that's only people who have no fillings, no scars, and no glasses. Hamish, that applies to you, doesn't it? Right, you're incapable of dowsing, we know this by now. But he then discovered map dowsing, which was very sad because he insisted that this was physical radiations. So therefore, these physical radiations, somehow the place knew that it had to send all the radiations to a hand-drawn sketch map. Whenever you're using Google, the place is sending its radiations there. Correct? You know this now. Oops. So, like I said, I tend to use a cooking metaphor. One of them is this half-baked, where we start off with, as I said, things like, clearly, I feel that this is so, therefore it must be true. What we're doing is we're muddling the artist space with the mystic space, the inner truth. The idea with the inner truth. The other one, which happens a lot both in science, dear old John Taylor, as one of the classic disaster areas, he tried to research dowsing and said, it must be electromagnetic, it must be in this frequency band, I can't find it there, therefore it doesn't exist. Even New Scientist hauled him over the coals for that one. He went overcooked. He'd made a bunch of assumptions and never had any mechanism for coming back up to check his assumptions. Another one that happens a lot in the field is where we, as I said, this one of, I got it there last time, I will therefore expect to get it this time. We have to keep on working all the time to check our assumptions, pull back. What are we feeling? How are we overlaying a pattern on top of a pattern of assumptions on top of the information we need? This is a real practical problem in every science, in every field of research, what we call pattern entrainment, where we tend to assume that things will fit a pattern, or that they shouldn't. Another one, perhaps a bit more subtle, is what we call the possession problem. One side of this is this whole thing about the idea of a sacred site. All of this comes out of our language. It's one of the places it comes from. The way we have subject, verb, object. The whole idea of objecting something means putting a boundary about it. If you used a language such as one of the Algonquin series in the northeast of the States, that's a language which everything is being and becoming. There is no state. Nothing is. It is always in flux. It is always changing. It's actually one of the best languages for trying to describe current nuclear physics, because everything is being and becoming. So when we have this idea of the sacred site, we've put an arbitrary box around something and said that everything else is profane, literally outside the temple. Most cultures that we deal with, most long-term cultures, don't have that separation. It's an artifact of our own culture. Another one which is useful is the whole idea of deconstruction, and this is a major driver in current archaeology, is deconstructing the assumptions, like dear old R.J.C. Atkinson with his Mycenaean daggers that he found in Stonehenge. There's some drawings that he found, or carvings, on the stones, which he said, therefore, the stone meant that Stonehenge must have been built by the Mycenaeans. But it's all coming out of a set of assumptions that all culture comes out of the East. When we did the recalibration of radiocarbon dating, suddenly there was a woolly idea about, well, perhaps everything came out of the West and went East, that the pyramids were built in reflection of Stonehenge. Perhaps it's a little more complicated than that. Perhaps it's useful to just allow things to be. But what is useful is to look carefully at what worldviews are what's called privileged, in other words, given a priority. One of the problems that we have in Earth Mysteries is far too many of the worldviews are privileged are actually New Age. Time we need really look carefully at what's going on. Another one I want to bring up. There is no boundary between the real and the imaginary. If we imagine it in terms of our perception, it is also real. When we are feeling or experiencing energies or other things happening at a site, all of it is real to us. That doesn't necessarily mean it exists for anyone else, nor does it necessarily exist in a concrete environment. One little warning, however. For example, think of the idea of the fairy. I mean, a lot of the energies and feel that we have, we might think in terms of fairy. If we come out of, say, an understanding of something like, Findhorn, sorry, memory going, what's old-timers disease, I think it's called. Findhorn, the whole idea of fairy, of divas. Just remember that in the Irish tradition, the fairies aren't little fluttery things at the bottom of the garden. They're standing outside the hollow hills, 7 feet tall, with long pointy ears and long pointy teeth. They don't feel pain, but they're fascinated that you do. There's a wonderful M.R. James ghost story called "Oh Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad." Some people may remember a BBC version of this that was done one year. An archaeologist, strict rationalist, back in the 1930s, working on a dig, finds a bone whistle, with an engraving in runic, which is essentially, "Oh, whistle and I'll come to you, my lad." Ha! Nothing happens. Ridiculous. No. Someone says to him that phrase about there are more things in our philosophy. There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamed of in our philosophy. To which he replies, there are more things in our philosophy than are dreamed of in heaven and earth. So he blows the whistle, and it comes for him. Foolish youth. So that another personal experience. This was in Stony Littleton. I didn't have the experience. Someone else did, but I was involved, as they say. What's that joke about the pig and the chicken and about ham and eggs? The chicken is involved, but the pig is committed. That I was at Stony Littleton with a friend, Jan, and I sat down very much in this kind of posture. This is quite a well-known carving. I forget where it was found. But is that what it is? That sounds painful. Would you want to be inside the cauldron? Yeah. Sitting very much in this posture, well, without the horns, one hopes, and just sort of trying to feel what the energies were. This is the back of Stony Littleton. If you know it, it's a long barrow fairly close to here, with a kind of pair of cross chambers, and then a threefold chamber at the end. So sitting at the very end, and which is about 30, 40 feet in, and just trying to feel the energies, and couldn't feel a damn thing. You know, oh well, nothing much. And Jan, who was then at the crossing, sort of looked at me and backed out of the chamber rather fast, and then said, "Tom, can you come here a moment? What's wrong?" Can you come here a moment? Okay. So I did. And she said, "Oh good, it is you." Why? Well, whoever was in there had horns for a start. So, what is real, what is imaginary? Some of this stuff is damn dangerous. One of the reasons I gave up on the whole dowsing field was a group who won't be named, but are actually the Fountain Group, who built, unfortunately, a whole religion out of a misreading or an assumption that one of the kind of epigrams or descriptions, sort of, analogies at the beginning of one chapter in Needles of Stone was physical fact. And unfortunately, when I got to Australia, they thought I was a guru for their religion. So I kept well out of their way for a long time. And finally, they persuaded me to come with them on a field trip. Didn't tell me what the field trip was. They were going to experiment with the energies, or experience the energies. It turned out to be a burial site at an Aboriginal massacre. And they were doing raising cones of power and all the rest on a massacre site. And did not notice, apart from the fact that it's completely illegal to tamper with an Aboriginal site, they didn't even notice that the Guardians were extremely angry, very angry about it, and said that really it was my problem and I ought to come to them for healing. At that point I gave up, seriously gave up. I started walking the 15 miles back to the nearest tube station. It really is some of this stuff like playing with matches in a firework factory. Please don't muck about. We have been very lucky so far, but some of this stuff is not really for playing with. So, what do we do about it? Well, mostly nothing. We need to keep the balance here. A sense of just working with it. But we do need to work on those problems seriously, or we will blow the credibility of the entire field. So looking forward, one which I notice has come up quite a few times is the real importance of field work. Really engaging our senses rather than sitting and arguing about things over the internet, but actually feeling what's going on. There's some very interesting work on the sense of local distinctiveness. We need much more precision and also cross-fertilization with other fields, but also to respect that there are real mysteries here, and that's part of the passion and the challenge. Being dry and dusty about all of this is going to kill the whole thing stone dead. So really, let's get off our butts, yeah? Actually get out in the field. A colleague of mine, it's actually Liz Pariah-Wyszynski, her experience working with Bella Snap, it takes at least 3 to 6 months of working with a place to actually build enough of a relationship with the place to start a true conversation. We can flit at high speed across sites, and we can build a kind of appreciation. But to start getting somewhere that has real changes, that creates real space for us, takes months. It isn't 5 minutes. And a lot of the subtle things that really matter the most only happen in walking the fields. One example is into visibility. This is one I actually checked this yesterday at Avebury. If you look at, there we are, we've got the magic of this thing. That's Silbury Hill, just visible from the obelisk on this side, on the left side of the screen. The notch that is well known and is also original, it's not a collapse, it's not a slump, the notch on the side of Silbury is known to be original. Silbury is probably the most stable of all of the structures. From an engineering perspective, it's a brilliant piece of earth engineering. It's built in segments like an orange. So it's very stable. I'm talking purely physically here. But that notch is exactly on the skyline. We only see that kind of thing when we're in the landscape. You won't get it from just looking in a book. I'm cheating here slightly. Almendres is a very large, very complex series of sites all around, somewhat to the west of Évora, which is a major centre. I noticed a couple of other people here have mentioned it. Évora was a very major site before the Romans came there. Amazingly, the Temple of Diana survived in Évora, despite being directly opposite the office of the Inquisition, because people have built houses through it. It's only because the houses have now been demolished, but I actually think it probably looked better with the houses in. We get this weaving of different times, different periods, the sense of a landscape. Almendres, by the way, is one of the most largest and most complex ones in Portugal. These strange egg-shaped ones. I think 9 of them have good carvings on. It has several known astronomical alignments, and one of them does vaguely go in the direction of Évora, but I'll need to check. I actually don't know. But it's a pretty picture, isn't it? But the main one is just simply engaging the senses. That sense of wonder, that sense of place, that sense of passion. Engage all the different elements, the way that everything connects together. The small animals and butterflies scuttering around, the dampness, the moss, the feel. Can you smell that? That's the kind of thing. And also, it's not just in the country. It's in the city too. Tony was just saying now, we have to remember that all of these things are happening in the same place at the same time. The other one, and I must admit, I had fun with this, enjoyment is absolutely central. However, we have to deal with the inevitable chaos. That is a real place name in Portugal. I love it. I'm sorry, I love it. I've got to have fun, haven't I? When we come to something like dowsing is useful, but this is an early Neolithic dolmen. It's something around about 6 to 7,000 years old. It's considerably old. It's actually earlier than the Bluestone period in Stonehenge. But at first glance, that looks like a Second World War bunker, right? So what the hell dowsing questions do we ask? Right? Dressed stone from 5000 BCE. This is getting kind of strange. Also, right next to it is this one. And I don't know what feel you get off that one now, but the feel of the two different sites is very different. That one's actually, to me, Notice it may be different for you. For me, that one is very uncomfortable. It's actually a wreck. But we also need to watch, too, for the subtle details, the things that matter, like this little person who appeared and disappeared from hiding inside the dolmen. So these are the things that make our day, I suppose, is the way of putting it. And if you want to look in Britain, there's one group who's done a lot on this. This is Common Ground. I don't know if anyone else, how many people have anyone else come across Common Ground? Yeah. Good, yeah. This is just two women who just push the one idea of local distinctiveness. What is it that makes somewhere particular? If you want a checklist that will really get you working with the Earth Mysteries field, go to their website, or better still, buy the poster. They have they have brilliant graphic design because they've got a lot of very good friends. But this is, demand the best of the new. Respect the local ghosts. So that, a couple of themes that come out of there. One of them is that each place is not just a place, but it exists within its landscape. Don't think in terms of sight. How do they weave? What is the space? Why is the space where it is? Tim Darvill, for example, the first archaeologist to be doing a new dig at Stonehenge for 35 years? His focus at the moment, the reason why he's talking with the British Society of Dowsers, is because his focus is on water. In what part does water play for a site to be where it is? But also respect the legends. It's an amazing one. It's about 9 feet high. Just round the corner. But there's a lovely present-day legend. If you throw a stone on top and it doesn't roll off, you'll get married soon. But other than that, is that an original legend? Doubt it. But it's nice. The weaving of the folklore is often very modern. But another one that Common Ground are very strong on is this thing that history is also now. There's an interweaving of the past, the present, the future. Sometimes a rather uncomfortable weaving, a kind of uneasy coexistence. And yet it's there. The moment we freeze sites, heritage style, they die. Sites are living, changing all the time. This, unfortunately, is the appropriately named Anta Grande de Zambojero, very close to the Almendariz Circle. It is big. It is appropriately named. The passage grave is 40 feet long. 40 feet long. 5 feet wide, over more than 6 feet high. The big stones you see there, the capstone has fallen off, but the stones are 20 feet high. It is, as you might say, big. It's also a wreck. Too many visitors. Ouch. Loving the site to death. We need a bit more discipline about how we share things around. Spread things around. Be aware that there is not just one place, the sacred site, but that everywhere is that. Wherever you are, that it is sacred. So the whole issue around discipline is perhaps one that's worth looking at. The 4 distinct disciplines, the classic 4, the artist, the mystic, the scientist, the magician. They're very different questions that they ask. What do I feel? What do I believe? How do I belong? What do I know? The whole idea of fact. And what can we do with it? I remember sadly in Glastonbury, some American idiot at a conference saying, we found these little titty crystals do great things to the energies at sites. What do you reckon I can do with this big sucker? And the answer is, back off. What can we do? We need to be thinking very carefully about what we do. But you can think of it as being, management consultants, which is my day job. We love two-axis matrices. And that's a very simple example. The inner world, the outer world, value and truth. There's another sequence as well, that from the artistic space we get ideas. From there we build a hypothesis. From there we gain the theory, and there's perhaps delusion of law. Don't play mix and match. Be clear which mode you're in and use them appropriately. The other one is building alliances. There's lots of different places that we can build alliances with. One is the whole environmental. Anyone else here come across the towers of power stuff? Yeah, right. The cat, they definitely appear to have impact on agriculture, which has some very interesting suggestions about past cultures, if it's true. There is some detailed scientific study going on, but watch for the problems about hype, watch for the problems about New Age and so on. We can overhype this stuff. Remember those of you with long memories, remember nuclear power, too cheap to meter? Oops. There's another whole area of archaeography, essentially where archaeology and art intersect. In some senses, we've got archaeologists looking very much at art, becoming artists. On the other side, we have archaeology-trained artists, like my colleague Liz again. Liz has 20 years' experience as an archaeological illustrator, moving very much to art, which gives us something like this. We have a kind of mixture of the archaeological precision with a sense for the energies in the space. We're also building new relations with archaeology, because archaeology has changed quite radically. 15 years ago, we still had the field dominated by Glyn Daniel, who bullied two of his students to do a book called Ley Lines in Question, which was about the most casual hatchet job that's been seen. It was a very clumsy piece of work, a very bad piece of special pleading. But what we're seeing now is that what used to be lunatic fringe is now mainstream. Archaeoacoustics is one, the whole idea of singing stones. The British Society of Dowsers have a manual now for dowsers working on archaeological sites. Strongly recommended. About the boring detail that, yes, we do need to do about surveys. What is the discipline about cover your loose? What are you doing? How are you doing your mapping? How are you making sure the site isn't damaged? There's also a really delicate balance. And if we really want to screw up our relationship with the archaeologists all over again, do as some friends of mine did with an archaeologist, which is go to a site, give him a date which they derived by dowsing, and say it's fact. Not recommended. However, this is something from that particular archaeologist. This is in Portugal. What he was looking at was this site. Rather like Seahenge, the locals had known perfectly well about it, but it just wasn't on the archaeological record. It's only come onto the archaeological record in the last couple of years, and that was from him. So it's again fairly near Évora. I'm not saying where, you'll see why. So that's him. And again, I won't give his name. Anyone who wants to contact him, give me an email and I'll forward it on. If you look on the far right, there's the ruins of a little mill that's left over from the 15th century. It's a watermill. It's in a curve of a river, very strange sight. The oddity is this. Steps carved into the stone. How nice. Between 8,000 and 10,000 years old. It leads up to the platform on the top. That's it. And there's the platform. "10,000 years of history in a well. It only takes one idiot with a metal detector and a spade to wreck the lot. What it really needs, urgently, is protection. which is exactly what it isn't getting. One of the difficulties we've got is that there's so much passion and so much need to share that we can forget that sometimes we need to keep our mouths shut. So we need to be very careful around the whole discipline of what we're doing. So just to summarize, we have real responsibilities in this work. We need to be very careful about this question about real and imaginary. If someone says, is it real or imaginary, it shows they've missed the question. They've missed the point. Anything we discover doesn't necessarily say anything. It just says what we found now. And the subtlety, the magic, the thing that is most joyful for me, and I think for many others also, is the subtle details. Is the sudden, like Michael again said about the arriving without warning at the lunar eclipse. And there is much, much more that we can learn from the needles of stone. Thank you. Says he desperately needing his glasses and pretending he doesn't need them. Yeah. So, like so many other people, my starting point was people like John Michel. Yes! And also Keith Critchlow. Keith Critchlow was the one who started me. For those of you who don't know him, he's so much of the country's expert on sacred geometry. He's the only Westerner to be asked to design a mosque in Mecca. So we're talking about someone who really knows his stuff. But what we had was this whole kind of blurring of disciplines, of mixing things together. Whole real excitement, but how much was actually real? And the other one that perhaps we didn't think about was some of the consequences of this excitement and the way we got everything going. We'll look at the Battle of the Beanfield very briefly later on. Those of you who remember this, Glastonbury in the 1970s, we had a very nasty period called No Hippies Served. All of the shops in the town had signs saying no hippies served. We have to remember that some of the other passions that we raise have some interesting and not very pleasant consequences. We need to be aware. So really, and I think I loved Michael Bott's comment earlier on today, that really we haven't got much further than Daniel Defoe's lovely phrase, that this is back in the 18th century. He said that all of that can be learned of them. Then we've got layers within layers within layers. That's the avenue leading away. It's been there for 5,000 years. How? We don't quite know. Too many sheep, perhaps. That's, I remember, yeah. Then we've got the 18th century milepost, the modern road, and the fence declaring possession. So we've got all this weaving of landscape and weaving of history, layers of time. We also had to deal with archaeologists, who at that time had some very interesting ideas about seamanship. This is Alan Sorrell, poor old Alan Sorrell, doing Richard Atkinson's reconstruction, otherwise known as suicide by sea. No one who has the slightest clue of seamanship would try to take a 4-ton stone on top of a raft across even the Bristol Channel, or actually across even a river. Much more likely, which is what dear old Tom Lethbridge suggested, and I noticed, Marshall, earlier today, that you sling it underwater between two kuraks, between two umiaks. We also have this whole kind of what you might call cultural imperialism, this sense of, well, they must be wild because we're civilized. Notice this lethal is that here they are. How much further really have we got from there? So, this is another frightening one. This is me back in the days when I still had hair. The whole thing of being enthusiastic, naive, and generally overexcited. We got lots of, and that whole feeling that so many of us have. I mean, anyone else, surely no one else has had any kind of excitement of this total stupidity called megalithomania. So, chasing wild ideas. Now, Michael Bott again was talking about staying at Rollright. I spent at least a couple of weeks living in a clapped-out Land Rover at Rollright. If you look closely, you can see the little piece of string leading away from the Kingstone at Rollright. It's almost straight down the screen, marking what I thought was an overground energy. As for what the hell, no question I could find something. As for what the hell it was, like Michael said today, I haven't a clue. I still haven't a clue. So playing with something like Rollright, the thing that we forget is just how complex these places are. For example, one of the things I found with dowsing was what seemed to be seven concentric circles coming outward, and it's spreading outward from there. In fact, what they call the geophys, the magnetic anomaly surveys, found what they thought was a sevenfold spiral. So I probably wasn't that far wrong. But there's water lines going over there. There's all sorts of stuff buzzing around. There's some lovely stuff for splitting headaches. We had a lovely one with one of my students who she was dowsing and tripped over what she thought was a bunch of chervil, which grabbed hold of her. And she put a hand down to pick up her pendulum and found it was standing vertically upright like the Indian rope trick. So we've had all sorts of fun like this, but for what the hell it means, we haven't a clue. So let's look at someone else. This is where we were in the 70s. Dear old John Michel in his bright orange trousers. Everyone loves Stonehenge, but, the gatherings of the tribes, all that kind of stuff. But they're just way too big and complex and layered. So that really, when we look at the kind of complexity of going on, anyone who thinks that they really know what's going on here is deluding themselves. We haven't got even anywhere near to starting. Most of what we've got now is still a little better than a guess. Back again. I was promising to do a book launch, but unfortunately health and safety don't like it. But anyone who's interested, Needles of Stone with a couple of new chapters is now back in print, and two others in the dowsing area I've got back in print as well. For those who can't afford, these two are also available free download. So, oh dear, Tom Graves. I've just got to remember to turn this thing on and put a timer on it, as I have been asked to do, as in, for God's sake, shut up sometime. Yeah, great. There we are. Okay, best known for something like Needles of Stone, general confusionist. Also, as you'll see, my real role is a nuisance. Because what I'm mostly concerned about is things like this disgusting words like methodology. So what I'm doing here is looking at three things, and this is really the two new chapters that went into Needles, were about looking back, what's happened over the last 30 years. Now, it's pretty terrifying to come back and look at a book after 30 years. What's going on right now, and some of the issues I'm seeing, and also some ways about what we can do about those problems now and where we can take them. So let's look back.